welcome. I'm Dr. Will Stroger here at CHEA Adult Skills Center, and I'm ready tonight for a wonderful show of CHEA Use of Knowledge is Power. Tonight in the studio, my guest is Ms. Kate Stanley with Legal Service of Eastern Michigan. We're going to be talking about redlining. So sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's show. Are you over the age of 25 and you haven't graduated from high school? Are you over the age of 30 and you're having problems with basic reading and math calculations? And you need to return to school but you're afraid of the traditional classroom setting? Are you over the age of 50 and you're having problems finding a job because you don't know how to use a computer? Well, don't worry, CHEA Adult Skills Center is here for you. We work with adults aged 25 years of age and older in basic reading, math, GED prep, and computer training. So please give us a call today because CHEA is here to help you. Thank you for joining me. I'm here in the studio again with Katie Stanley with Legal Services of Eastern Michigan. Katie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Tonight we're going to be talking about fair housing and what is fair housing. But before we get into that wonderful conversation, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Legal Services of Eastern Michigan?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So we are the only free civil legal aid in the city of Flint. We also cover 14 surrounding counties, so a large portion of the Eastern District of Michigan. But essentially, if you live in the city and you qualify under certain income guidelines, we can help you with civil legal issues ranging from family law to landlord-tenant issues to fair housing to crime victim representation and support. We also have special advocates for special education, such as IEPs and things like that. And we do have a few staff on site for public benefits issues as well.
Okay, and you are an attorney.
I am.
And how long have you been an attorney?
3 years now.
3 years. And you graduated from which college?
Western Michigan University.
Western Michigan University. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
How do you like being an attorney though?
You know, it's a privilege to be in a position to be of service to people in that way, I feel. So I'm grateful for that experience and opportunity. And I did go to law school with the intention of being in service. To my community, so I'm grateful that I get to occupy the station that I do, but it comes with its own unique challenges, I think. It's an adversarial profession, and attorneys are kind of an interesting group of people, you know?
I would say. Now, do you specialize in a certain area of law?
You know, I always say effectively harnessed my adult ADHD, because I've kind of... I started with crime victim advocacy, so I represented victims of elder abuse and domestic violence in a wide range of issues and appearances across the 14 counties, and then I kind of switched to some public benefits work and then housing and fair housing, and now I've moved on to be our community engagement officer, so a lot of what I do now is education-based. I go out in the community a lot, make sure that folks know that our services are there.
Let's talk about fair housing. First of all, give us a definition of fair housing.
So fair housing, what we do, it's not your general landlord-tenant cases, although it does arise often out of those scenarios. These are the cases where folks are discriminated on based on a protected class characteristic.
Okay.
So say that you go to search for a home and you're turned away because of your race or because of your familial status. Say you're a single mother with children or an unwed mother. We see cases like that more often than you'd think.
Unwed mother?
There are some...
You've been discriminated
yes.
for housing because you're not married.
Yes, or yeah, because, you know, people have different views on what's moral by their standards, and sometimes they feel if they're in a position of power they can impose that on others, and the law is there to protect us from those sorts of circumstances.
The United States is filled with a lot of single mothers. I'm just like Florida on that one.
Well, there was one case in Florida recently where the landlord asked her to provide a ultrasound to prove she wasn't pregnant because he didn't want to rent to her if she was going to have a small child.
My.
So it's unusual when you talk about it to people that aren't kind of in this line of work. They think, well, why do you do this or why do you need this now? We've had fair housing for 50 years, and why civil rights are no longer an issue. A lot of people mistakenly think that. But we see it all the time. We see it most frequently, like I said, with familial status and disability status. A lot of disabled veterans. We have a lot of clients that are disabled veterans. And we uncover those things through our testing program.
Okay, so when you said protective classes, what are the categories up under a protective class?
So we have different, federal or state. So In the federal classes, you have, like I said, religious status, disability, race, color, familial status. But you can, as a state, the state governments can expand those rights. They can't restrict them any further, but they can expand on them, and Michigan has added age and marital status as well.
Okay, alrighty. In the city of Flint, do we have a lot of incidents that occur with discrimination when it comes to housing?
I would say you do, and you wouldn't know it if you weren't testing. So just to explain what I mean when I say a test, we send essentially a mystery shopper. These folks are volunteers, but they get a small stipend and mileage. We train them, and they get a narrative, and they'll go to try to rent a unit or a home, and then we'll send someone from a different protected class and see if they're treated differently. And so if you're the person that's trying to rent a house, you go in, you have this encounter. If they say there's no units available, you would just think there was no units available. But if someone comes in after you, for instance, say we're testing religious status or your religious beliefs, and we send someone in that's wearing a hijab or national origin even, and then we send someone in who's not, and if they're treated differently or told something differently or offered different terms or conditions, then we can uncover that discrimination.
What normally happens to the organization that you find out has discriminated against the individual?
It kind of depends on how severe and pervasive it is, but there's damages under the Fair Housing Act that you can seek. You can also seek to implement new policies for that landlord, whoever it might be, if it's something like a small incident where they can implement new policies so it doesn't happen again. A lot of times our cases go through administrative steps first. So we work with HUD and the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, and an investigator gets involved, and a lot of times they go through those channels first. So it kind of depends on what the case is and how pervasive it is, but there's all different kinds of remediation available.
I think a lot of times a corporate type of apartments is something when people are discriminated against. I want to talk about just your average person who is a landlord. I'm a landlord, but I guess I can go from the corporate level. Do they have to meet the same requirements as a corporation who rent out apartments? So if I just own 50 houses and I decide to rent them out to an individual, am I still held accountable to the same laws and regulations as a corporation is?
That's a great question, and I would say that from what we've seen, most often the bigger agencies, they're well trained. They understand the law. They don't violate it as often. It's more often the lay landlord that's just kind of individually involved, and that doesn't have the education to really act in a way that's in accordance with the Fair Housing Act or the ADA. But yeah, the same laws do apply. The only case in which, if you were a personal landlord where it wouldn't, is if you lived in the unit and there was less than 4. So if you live in the home that you're renting and it's 4 or less units, you can, if I'm a woman and I want to rent a room in my house only to another woman, I could say that if there's less than 4 units and I live there. But I can't advertise discriminately still. Discriminatory advertising is still not allowed. So.
Okay. I don't know if you can answer this question because you're fighting for the tenant opposed to the landlord. Where would they receive this type of training in order for them to be better,
I'm so glad you asked that. So Legal Services of Eastern Michigan Fair Housing Center provides free fair housing training. We do it all different kinds of organizations. I've trained domestic violence shelters to housing assistants like shelters and all different kinds of folks. We do trainings sometimes as a part of agreement with someone who's violated the law. Like we'll write an agreement with them that if they participate in this training, that's a part of the agreement we make. But we do provide free training. It's part of our services as a legal aid.
That's good. I can't open the door and say things should be mandatory for just general landlords, but I'm sure you would have more problems with a general landlord because they don't have the training, and nor did they know that there was specific training that they could be abreast to in order for them to be better landlords. Let's get into evictions. Like I stated earlier when you and I was talking, eviction seems to be more prevalent in the wintertime when I receive phone calls. But let's talk about evictions, period. What is an eviction?
It could be a variety of things. It could be a non-payment case. A lot of times we see evictions with month-to-month tenants where the landlord just doesn't want to lease anymore. Sometimes it could just be that they're a month-to-month tenant, they're not in a lease or a contract, and the landlord doesn't want to rent anymore. That happens too.
Okay.
Sometimes it's a lease violation, so if there's a no pet policy and you don't have a reasonable accommodation or occupancy issues, it could be a variety of things, and there's different timing triggers for all the different issues. Or it could be like hazardous, right? Like someone's cooking meth in your apartment, and you don't want them to be doing that because it's not safe for other tenants.
Let's go about, because you triggered something. Pets. I was just listening on the radio, and I think it's in Europe. They're about to change some of the laws about flying with
That's
companion.
here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have the Michigan radio. I listen to it every morning. So.
Well, they're taking public comments for 2 months now. I think until, I don't know the exact date, but they just opened public comments for that.
Okay. Matter of fact, I'm going to talk about 2 things. I'm going to talk about marijuana, and I'm going to talk about pets.
Sounds like a great conversation.
Yeah. So let's talk about the pets. So they're going to be changing some of the laws, and they're going to be restricting some of the, I don't know if it's the dogs or just some of the animals that people are bringing on airlines saying that they're therapy animals. Now, in apartments or in a house that you're renting, do they have to accept a therapy animal?
Yeah. And it doesn't matter, so as long as it's related in nexus to alleviating the symptoms of your disability and you ask for a reasonable accommodation, they have to allow that accommodation, and it doesn't matter if you have a breed restriction. That case was recently litigated. It doesn't matter, or the HUD issued guidance around it also, and it doesn't matter if there's weight restrictions, if you have a no pet policy. Yeah.
You still have to accommodate. Now, is there some type of paperwork the individual will have to state that, look, this is why I have the therapy dog, so therefore you have to allow me to bring my animal into this place?
Yeah, and well, they don't have to provide it necessarily to the landlord. They don't have to reveal what their disability is, but they do have to get a letter from their primary care provider. The things online that you see, or where people order vests on Amazon, or order a letter on the internet, those are not legitimate.
They order
they're like big
letters on the
scams.
internet?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that think if they pay, this website however much money, they'll send them a letter saying they need. But really, all you need to do is go to your doctor and say, hey, I recently had a veteran who he had really severe post-traumatic stress, and he would wake up in the middle of the night and become violent. And his dog, when he would start to have these night terrors, would comfort him and wake him up in a way that would make him calm and not become violent. And he was in a danger to his wife because he was disoriented and afraid. And that was one of the accommodations that we were able to get. When you think of mental illness-related accommodations, I think people mistakenly think of those folks on airplanes that just want their dog, to be up in the cabin with them, and don't really. Hopefully no one does this, but don't really have a legitimate disability. But the clients that we see, a lot of them are veterans. A lot of them we had a client recently who had actually a service dog that would detect her seizures, that she was evicted for having that dog. We had a client whose service dog would pull her wheelchair. She was in a wheelchair, and he would help guide her in the wheelchair, and she was evicted for having a dog against a no pet policy. So those are the cases that we see. We don't see,
I mean, those are some really, those are the ones I've never seen.
The snake on the airplane.
They're not, because I think in California they had a problem with someone bringing a peacock.
Yeah.
So.
And the new changes that they're trying to make are the Department of Transportation. So it'll be interesting to see how that.
It really is.
Because they're wanting to now have the animal be trained to be observed. They want to see that it's trained.
Yes.
So that's one of the new requirements.
You have people, you have individuals who are allergic to dogs. And if you get a plane seat and you sit down, you may be sitting by someone who has a therapy dog. There's just a lot, It's amazing how we didn't have them. And all of a sudden we do have them. What has changed so much that now we have therapy dogs on the airplanes with us, and they're not in cargo. So that's just my take on it. Marijuana is legal
in Michigan. Not
only
federally.
in the state.
Yeah. So you can't, where you think of a disability, say we had a client once who had, she had cancer and she had a medical marijuana license and she was living in a voucher unit. Voucher units are federally subsidized.
Okay.
She can't have, under the Illegal Substances Act, have that there. So that, I think it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out, because it's really up in the air.
Because it's only legal in the state, but federal government is still against the law, and public housing is funded through federal dollars.
So we had a client once he lived in public housing, and his friend across the street had a medicinal marijuana card before it was even recreationally legalized.
Okay.
And the guy would sit on his porch and, use his medicine. And this guy was across the street with the same license in a federal unit, in a voucher unit, and he couldn't.
Do it.
He
Can't
couldn't
do it.
And he would watch this guy, across the street have a whole different set of standards applied to him. So
let's just say if a regular landlord, and it's legal now, you can have so many plants in your house. Is it 12 plants you can have?
12, yeah.
12 plants you can grow.
I will preface this with I don't practice anything marijuana related at work, but I did used to work for an attorney who did that kind of work.
Do I have the right to say, look, you can't have marijuana on my property?
See, I think that is going to be one of the questions that needs answering, because the number one issue that I think of is no smoking policies.
True.
You have people in no smoking units that pay and prefer to be in a no smoking unit, or may have COPD or another issue that impacts their ability to be around smoke, or might be allergic to it. So are those things going to apply to marijuana smokers also? It'll be interesting to see how that, it's kind of like a no man's land right now.
It's amazing. We humans have complicated so much in a short period of time. I was on Facebook one day, and someone had posted an article and said, is this what's happening in Flint? And so I posted back. I only post when it's a good conversation, because, I don't want them saying, we need to call CHEA, we need to call and say something bad to me.
Leave a comment.
Yeah, so I said, well, redlining has been going on in Michigan for quite some time, and in Flint. Please watch my show with Stanley. From when we did the radio show, we talked about redlining. So I want to touch on redlining, because that has been a part of Flint history, redlining. So exactly what is redlining?
That's a great question. It's not just a part of Flint history, it's a part of our history as a country. After the Great Depression, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created, and the idea was that part of the New Deal was that we would get new infrastructure, bridges, things like that you think of when you think of the New Deal, but also part of it was low interest loans and things that had to do with housing. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created to create what they called residential security maps, and that's what we know as redlining. So essentially they would outline areas that they thought were high risk for loans, and those areas would be red and then blue for less, and then so on and so forth. The problem was that at the time, the determinants were largely based on race, on your national origin, on things that greatly impacted people's ability to secure equity in the future. So most folks gain their inherited wealth, or their wealth and the familial wealth, from equity that they have in their homes. And that's why you see these large gaps in people of color, their credit and access to credit, and the areas that were redlined during that time, even though it's not happening now, that banks can't say, I'm not going to give you a loan.
That's true.
Along those redlined areas, you still see all these disparities. You see, and it's not just access to credit or home ownership, it's other things like access to good food, grocery deserts, they call them, the school and tax base, your level of quality of your education. So there's this whole broad spectrum of quality of life issues, I would say, that are civil rights issues that were impacted by policy decisions made by our government.
Okay. So do you feel as though redlining is still going on here in this area, or are we, what's the word I want to use? Are we trying to recover from redlining from our history?
So you can't redline anymore. You can't deny someone a loan based on the color of their skin or their national origin or their religion. But like I said, along those areas, you still see a lot of the same issues. We're more segregated now than we were 100 years ago, and you see that along a lot of these redlined areas. And if you drive down to Detroit, for example, the 8 Mile Wall still stands.
Yes,
There was guidance issued by the government that said that incompatible racial groups should not be next to one another, live next to one another. And the way that they got around this is they would build walls and highways to separate these communities. And a lot of these walls still stand, and every time I drive to a Tigers game and I see it, I think, I can't believe this is still here.
Yeah, you know, you made me think about 475. I remember where my aunt lived, where 475 is at, correct, you know, where 475 is located now. So I never thought about expressways dividing, or was a way of creating a red line. Using an expressway. What other things were used to create red lines?
I mean, there's a thing called restrictive covenant, which is now also not allowed, but GM, for instance, had housing when they were bigger in Flint, and it was segregated. And Flint, actually, in fact, was the first city in the nation to have a fair housing law. And there's a whole really interesting story behind how that happened. And Mayor McCree, who was one of the first black mayors in the nation, worked to have a sleep-in strike to make that happen. But essentially what they had, where they'd sell a house, and in the deed was something called a restrictive covenant that said you couldn't sell to a certain group of people. So they'd say, you can only sell to white people, sell this house to a white person. And people would, something called steering, they would get steered from certain neighborhoods to others, which is no longer allowed either. They'd say, I don't think you really want to live here. I think you want to live here.
Wow.
And actually there was a recent case that the ACLU, my friend Mike Steinberg, litigated up north, where there were restrictive covenants on a home that was inherited, and it was supposed to be only inherited to Christians. There was a strict restrictive covenant in it that only a Christian could have title to the home. And the girl that inherited it ended up being Jewish. And she wasn't going to be allowed to keep this home because of her religious faith.
Yeah, again, us humans have complicated so many things. Well, because of her religious belief.
Which, in everybody, you know, I hear so often, especially, I hear so often that people don't think there's a need for this kind of advocacy anymore, that it's kind of in our rearview mirror. And it's not.
That is true.
I think it's even, if anything, it's more slippery than it once was. It's not as overt. People.
I agree, because if we just pay attention to Genesee County, public housing has opened the doors for a lot of people to move into areas that normally didn't allow a certain population of people to come into. But let me, since I'm thinking about that, President Obama, did he implement some type of law or something whereas cities or certain areas had to have more public housing vouchers, or more people low income to be able to move into those areas?
Well, you know, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but I do know that that administration did work to increase access to affordable housing. And I'm not allowed to have a political opinion. I'm only allowed to make educational statements in the position that I'm in. But another issue that we see in Flint with vouchers that I don't think a lot of people are aware of is that we don't have source of income discrimination protection. So that means that a landlord can actually advertise, I don't want to rent to a person with vouchers. Whereas if you go to somewhere like Ann Arbor that does have source of income protection, you can take your voucher and live anywhere.
And that's not a form of discrimination.
Not in Flint. We don't have one of those ordinances here. And there is a great advocacy group called the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness that's working to make a statewide source of income discrimination law. Because it's hard enough for folks to find a place to port their voucher that will accommodate their family, let alone when having to deal with, you know, landlords that are making assumptions about what type of tenant they'll be based on their income or their need for help.
Tell me the difference between Section 8 and a voucher.
Well, the Section 8 has vouchers.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's all different kinds of programs. In Flint, we have, for now at least, we have the one stop that you can go to in Flint through Shelter of Flint, where they'll kind of do an intake for you and figure out which housing you best are suited for, if you qualify. So most cities have a program or a HARA that helps homeless folks find
Okay.
housing.
Okay, so Section 8 is a voucher. Got it. So
Yeah.
you can say you're not accepting Section 8.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I didn't know that. I thought it was something different. So if Michigan has vouchers for veterans, is that the same thing?
Not, there are different, like I said, there's all different kinds of programs.
Okay.
But Section 8 is just one specific program.
Got it. Anything else you want to share with us about Legal Services of Eastern Michigan or anything that's going on in the city of Flint with Legal Services of Eastern Michigan?
You know, we're just really happy to be a part of such a robust, fantastic community with organizations like yours. If anyone has any questions or any need, our number is 800-322-4512. You can call and get an intake. Even if you don't qualify, we can help sort you out maybe to the right place to go so we can get you some help.
Is there any upcoming events that Legal Services have?
There is. So we do yearly under our Education and Outreach Grant, we do a fair housing conference.
Okay.
We do it in partnership with the University of Michigan Flint. We do it at the North Bank Ballroom. If you're a U of M student or faculty, it's free for you. General public is $35, but we have scholarships available. This year we have a really great lineup. We have some folks from the Michigan Advocacy Program coming to talk about. They supplemented Matthew Desmond's eviction data, Michigan-specific eviction data. So they're going to give, their project will have just ended, and they're going to give the summary of their findings. And the preliminary findings are finding that Flint, Genesee County has one of the highest rates of evictions. So that would be really interesting to hear. We're also having Florence Roisman come out, who's a renowned civil rights and housing law advocate. She's a law professor in Indiana. And also Richard Rothstein, who's the author of The Color of Law. He wrote, I would say, the seminal book on how the U.S. government segregated America and redlining. It's an incredible book. He's going to be Skyping in. We'll have copies of the book there for folks. And it's going to be a great event.
Wonderful.
Food and breakfast and snacks included.
There is one thing. Right now in Genesee County, we're counting the homeless.
Yes, the pit count.
Yes.
The point in time
count. Do you want
count.
to share a little bit about that?
So I think it happened yesterday, but essentially, so we have, every community in Michigan has a continuum of care. It's folks that get together to try to end homelessness.
Yes.
And we're fortunate to be a part of that group. And every year, volunteers try to count the number of homeless to see if we're doing our job effectively, if we're reducing homelessness in our communities.
All righty. Katie, I want to tell you thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
The information you presented was very valuable to me and to my viewers. Viewers, thank you so much for joining me. Hopefully you have a wonderful work week.